Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are sharing some tips for attorney bar applicants. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We are here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about taking the shorter attorney's version of the bar exam. And some people may be surprised to hear this exists because it's not actually an option in every state. But some states will let licensed attorneys who have a certain amount of experience skip the MBE, and only take the written part of the bar exam. What a treat! Although this sounds great, there are some things to keep in mind before deciding to do the attorney's version if you're eligible. First off, I think there's something to ask yourself. What do you think, Lee?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think you need to really think about this MBE section, which is the part that, you're oftentimes allowed to drop. And, the MBE stands for the multi-state bar exam, right? Yes. I was like, when I said it out loud, I was like, I don't think I've said that in a long time. But it's also called the multi-state, or it used to be called the multi-state because it's the test given around the country at the same exact time on the same exact day. And so, they're basically saying, like, if you pass the MBE one place, you don't need to pass it somewhere else. But for some people, the MBE is actually a boost to their score. And some people, it can, be kind of their downfall. So it really depends on the person. So me personally, don't really like multiple choice questions. I would have happily dropped that MBE, but I know you are a little bit different.
Right. I mean, I think what you need to ask yourself here is really, do you tend to overperform on multiple choice tests? If so, you actually might want to consider taking the full version of the exam with the MBE. Because you can actually pad your score with multiple choice. It only covers 7 topics versus a lot more on the rest of the test. So it's a more controlled universe of material. And learning these topics really well is actually going to help you probably on at least a few essays because there's overlap with the essays. So I think only in this situation, for someone who's always been a really good standardized test taker, will it make sense to consider taking the full version. I mean, I think in general, for most people, this is probably not something you want to subject yourself to.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time to study for the MBE, and time is generally limited if you're an attorney who's also working.
Yeah.
Plus, the MBE is hard.
Yeah.
This is
like hard. I mean, a passing score is like 70%.
Yeah. So, this is only worth considering if you're really good at multiple choice. I mean, I happen to be, that's one of my skill sets. I'm really good at multiple choice. I remember I took a placement test in Spanish for a Spanish school in Mexico, and it was a multiple choice test. And I could tell I was overperforming on it because I'm just good at multiple choice. And so, I wrote the person said, look, you gave me this test. Like, I really feel like I probably did better than is merited by my actual Spanish knowledge. They're like, oh, no, it's very accurate. So I show up the first day, and of course, I don't have anything. I'm in this test. This situation is way too advanced. I'm just good at multiple choice in any language.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, I mean, we've all known people like that, who are just good at tests. I have friends who, may have been still drunk or hungover and took the SAT at the same time I did and got similar scores, even though I studied for the SAT. It's just because there are people for whom multiple choice tests just kind of make sense. And, I think what can happen when you've been out of exam taking mode for a while is I think sometimes people are unsure of that. And so I oftentimes will encourage people to just take a practice test. Download a trial of something like Adaptabar. Usually these tools will give you a free trial and just start doing some questions, because I think that sometimes we can get in our head and be like, well, I'm so great at multiple choice, but I haven't taken a test in 5 years, but I'm not, and I just don't know. Whatever, just go back and try it. If you try it and you have a visceral reaction to how either awful it is or, like can't imagine studying for that portion of the test again, well, then that's your answer. I think it's like if you can't make yourself sit and do a practice test, then that's probably a good sign that you're not going to sit and practice for that part of the test.
Yeah, see, I think they're kind of fun.
Well, yeah, but that's why we run a bar prep company.
Exactly. I mean, I never want to take the bar again, but
right.
I actually don't mind multiple choice, but I think that's a great point. If you're just like, I cannot do this. And I think in general, people should probably not take the MBE, but there are cases, you know, sometimes you can see from your previous score reports or something that, you did substantially better on that part of the test. Then I think it's worth considering. I mean, in general, I don't really advise people to do it just for the timing aspect. It's going to be probably at least a third of your study time, but it does give you that more controlled universe, which I think can be a benefit.
Yeah. I think trying to get information about your score is good to have. I mean, that can be tricky depending on your jurisdiction. If you passed another bar, they may not tell you your score. You can always, if you were like to waive into Washington, D.C., you could see if your score would transfer, and that would give you like the clue that it was over a certain threshold, which I believe is 135, but don't quote me on that. So it can be hard to know where you fall. I have seen such a variety of MBE scores with folks who've passed and failed the bar that I think sometimes, individuals don't even 100% know. So if you're really on the fence, just take a practice test. And if it is awful, then that's the information that you need.
Yeah, but if you take a sit down after 5 or 10 years of being out of taking the bar exam and you get 60 or 70%, you're like, sweet, like I should definitely take this test or this part of this test.
Exactly. But, if you get 30%, right? Well,
then give it up.
Then give it up. Then
time.
Don't waste your time. Or if you have really limited study time and you just don't have time to, to really focus in and put in the effort. The other thing I do want to remind people, if they're listening to this and they have been practicing for a while, is one, the last time you took the MBE, it may not have had civil procedure on it.
True.
So that's something to always keep in mind. And also that we do know what is most heavily tested on a good chunk of the MBE. So if you do go back to study and you want to refresh your recollection, please don't sit down with some sort of 500-page outline book and start studying that way, because it's not the most efficient way to study. They do tell you what's the most heavily tested of a good chunk of the MBE, and that's really where you want to start.
Right. And, we've talked before, you can actually just go download a lot of that information straight from the test maker, and they'll tell you, 20% of this topic area is going to be these topics and 40% is going to be these topics. They're not hiding the ball, really.
No, they're really not. It's like hearsay, super heavily tested. You can't go into the MBE and be like, hearsay, not so good.
Like standards of review and con law. Got to be pretty solid on this.
Right, exactly. It's like they're going to test that. Even though it feels like most of the MBE is on mortgages, it's really
That was
not.
just you, Lee.
That was just me? Is it only me that thinks that the MBE was all mortgages? Is that my warped memory of the multiple choice section of the bar exam?
Yeah, you're still traumatized.
I know. It's statistically impossible that it was all on mortgages.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they didn't give you like 80% of the questions on mortgages.
Really, that's how I remember it. I don't know. I must have gotten a different test than everybody else.
They're like, we're just giving you the all mortgage one.
The all mortgages test. Yeah. You got an A in real property. You'll be fine.
Yeah, I still have nightmares about those like notice and race notice and notice, race notice. And you're just like, what is this? Why did you have to give them all the same name?
I know. And then all the the lien holder and this and oh my gosh, the hierarchy of all of the.
Well, and then you do things like, buy real estate or refinance and realize it's actually kind of important.
I know. Which is why they should just teach that stuff in law school. It's actually
you're reading the deed. You're like, the title report. How interesting.
Oh, yeah. I know. Well, I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast, but the last time my husband and I bought a house, they screwed up our grant deed.
I had a refi and they put the wrong, I can't remember, it was the wrong block number or something. I'm like, this is not the legal property I'm buying or refinancing.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah. And then they left me off of the deed. And then when I got upset about it, the woman was like, well, I mean, we'll get to fixing it. I was like, no, get to fixing it.
They were shocked when I was like, this is not right. You have to fix it before I sign. And they're like, oh, well, I'm like, this is the legal property. I'm a lawyer. I read these things.
Yeah, it was amazing. Yeah. So anyway, this stuff in the real world, kind of important. So at least if you learn this stuff, you'll see it come up in the real world. But in the end, it's all about, is this going to be like a boom to your score or a burden. If it's going to be a burden, let it go. If it's going to be a boom, take it.
Right. Yeah. I think in general, people should probably not redo the MBE. But I would say, 25-30% of people, it's going to be to their benefit.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think you can also look at just your history of standardized tests. Like you were saying, if you're just one of those people who like did well on the SAT, did well on the LSAT, like just has consistently done well on standardized tests. And you know who you are. You all know who you are.
Oh, yeah. Well, then when they gave us the SAT in like middle school, I did really well on it.
Yeah. But what was funny is a boyfriend I had when I was studying for the LSAT was also one of those people, like 98th percentile on the business school entrance exam, or which one is that? Not the MCAT, that's medical school.
Gosh, I can't remember. It's a hard one. You can't remember.
It is, yes. It's also hard. But he was like, whatever, the LSAT. And then he got the logic games. And he was like, after a while, he was just like, well, these are annoying. Like he kind of like threw the book.
Oh, those are my favorite part. I love those.
I know. Yeah. But it was just funny. I was like, well, at least you think they're hard. And some of them are.
Oh, they're definitely hard. I mean, it's all technique, but they are challenging.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. So we work with a lot of attorney applicants, and I think it's important to talk about why attorney applicants do not succeed, because in states like California that have this attorney applicant option, the pass rate is actually fairly low.
It is, which is kind of surprising to me. I mean, I would not have suspected that had I not looked it up.
Because you figure everybody's already got a law license.
Right. Like obviously you're capable of being a lawyer. You can probably pass the bar. Not true.
Not true. So I think there are a couple of reasons why. I think the first one is, they're typically already lawyers, so they're usually working and they don't have the time and energy to devote to studying. I mean, we have had so many students who will say, oh, yes, well, I have a trial coming up 2 weeks before the bar, but it's totally fine. And you're like, well, it's not fine.
I'm working 70 hours a week. Do you think I can study on top of that? No.
Like, no. Or can I take no time off before the test? No. So that is a major concern, is just being able to have the time. So if you are busy, I just think that it makes much more sense to slow burn your study or wait until you can take a couple weeks off before to be able to get a block of time to study full time before the test.
Right. And I think also people's lives have typically gotten more complicated between, you just graduated law school, you studied for your first bar, you took it, you started working. But now if you're, 5, 10, 15 years into your career, you may have kids, you may have family members, you've got all this stuff going on that you didn't have the first time around.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, life is a lot more complicated. If we can make it through this podcast without one of my children walking in, I will be shocked considering how the day has gone. If the cats don't complain and the kids don't walk in, I feel like I'm winning life today.
Making it work.
Making it work. I also think that it's very tricky because of the writing style that the bar exam requires, because it's different. It's a different style than oftentimes a lot of people, use during practice. And then they already think that they kind of know the law. But the thing is, the bar covers a lot of stuff that whatever you practice, it's not going to cover. Like, it's going to have all this stuff you don't practice on it. So if you are an insurance litigator, insurance litigation isn't even on the bar.
Yeah. I was a patent litigator when I sat for my second bar exam when I was working in California. And I was like, oh, too bad you don't test me on literally anything I do at work, except possibly some basics of civil procedure.
Right. I know. And so that's a major problem, is like what you're doing in your day-to-day job is typically not what you're going to see on that test. But I think the actual biggest problem that I see is an unwillingness to shift your writing style back to this academic format of writing that you had in law school. I think that is really, the crux of the issue for many practicing lawyers, not wanting to write a performance test in the way the examiners want, not wanting to write an issue spotter the way the examiners want.
I think that's right. Let's be honest. Sometimes we see a little bit of arrogance around this. Like, I'm a lawyer. Like, obviously I know how to write. Like, how dare they tell me that my writing is not up to speed? This is very insulting. I think it's important to think of this really as a test, not as an actual exercise in practicing law. The question is, what do you need to do to get to the score that you need to pass a particular test? And this has little to nothing to do with your actual ability to practice law. And separating those things and really thinking of it as this artificial exercise is going to be very beneficial for most people.
Yeah. I mean, I remember us helping a friend of mine who moved to Colorado, which is the UBE. And she was licensed in California. She was off cancel. So she had been practicing for quite a while. And, we had this great plan of how she was going to study. And then of course she got super busy, and then it kind of became crunch time. And she sends, a performance test for review. And, we sent back a lot of comments. And she was kind of like, what? And I'm like, well, I get it, but like, don't you want to pass? Like, you kind of have to switch this. And so she just started cranking out practice after practice until we were able to get her style, back to what it needed to be. But, I think it was kind of shocking for her. And I think she's a brilliant woman. She's a great lawyer, but she's just definitely had that response of, I'm sorry, you have comments. What?
What? This isn't perfect? Are you kidding me? I think it's just a different exercise. I mean, the point of the bar exam is minimum competency based on things that you've stuck into your head, and then like basically following directions and completing a performance test in the time that you are allotted. Mm-hmm. It is not go off and research for 2 days some fine point of law, which is, more along the lines of what most people are doing when they're working. Like, you're called in as a lawyer to work on hard problems. The bar exam is not necessarily a hard problem. It's an easy problem in a way if you have the information.
Right. Yeah. So it's just, it's just one of those things. You kind of like got to layer, you go to the side, even if you're a super impressive lawyer. Remember, plenty of super impressive lawyers have failed the bar exam. So this isn't about, you being impressive or not being impressive. This is about playing the game as presented to you. And that's really what you want to focus on. I think one of the things that a lot of people struggle with is this idea that it's a test. You're not actually practicing law. Like, you have to like explain your work in a way. I remember specifically one attorney applicant and I talking about feedback, and they were like, a client would be furious if they got a memo like this from me, talking about all this stuff that is not on point, or if I researched all this stuff. And I was like, I know this is an intellectual exercise. There's no client. Like, you just have to be willing to let that stuff go.
Right. And your client, if, to the extent there is one, probably needs more explanation than someone who is like general counsel of the company that you're working with.
Right.
Who already knows many things.
Right. Yeah. I think you're back to kind of explaining your work, like you're talking to your grandmother, one of our early blog posts, I remember, right, that you wrote on the Law School Toolbox, explaining something to your grandmother, showing your work like high school math. I mean, this is not real life. You kind of are going through the intellectual exercise and trying to show your work so you can collect as many points as possible.
Right. And that's the whole thing. A lot of people maybe have this information in their head, but they're not writing it down. And it may seem like some of it's too simple to write down. Well, that question was obvious. Why would I have answered it? It's like, well, because you were going to get a point if you answered it, and you didn't answer it because you didn't bother writing down what you already knew. So you lost the point. Congratulations. You did not pass.
Yeah. So, I think there are some very specific kind of focused advice that we have to attorney applicants to be successful. I think, we've already talked about the issue of work and balance, but the key thing is you got to probably start early if you're working, and you really have to be realistic. And I think it's like, not just realistic. I think you have to be conservative about your bandwidth. Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned earlier, oftentimes at this point in your life, you have other obligations outside of work. And so you not only have to consider your work obligations, but family obligations and friends obligations and other life obligations. You got to put it all in the blender and see how it's all going to mix together.
Right. And we talk sometimes about, making contributions to your study bank. And I think starting early and doing this consistently allows you to be prepared when almost inevitably something pops up at work and you can't focus for a few days. Obviously you want to try to plan around those things, but those things always come up. Yeah. So you've got to allocate, you've got to have some slack basically in your plan so that you're not so stressed that it's like one thing happens and suddenly there's no possible way you're going to get this done.
Yeah. So we also talked about, this need to practice, to change your writing style, to, get back in this academic style of writing. So you need to practice early, you've got to practice often, and you got to get feedback. I mean, when we have had attorney applicants be successful, it is always that they've gotten plenty of feedback on their work so that they know, one, that the studying they're doing is getting the results they need, and two, that they know exactly how they need to shift back to that academic style and make sure they're collecting all the points possible.
Right. I think it's also important to keep in mind, the exam you're taking may be different from the one that you passed before. So especially if you're sitting in California, it's a very different test than the 30-minute MEE questions that you may have done or something similar. These are 60-minute questions. They're looking for something different, or vice versa. If you sat in California and now you're sitting for the UBE somewhere, those are half as long. They're looking for something different. You have to study differently for these things.
Yep. I think one of the big mistakes we see when people are studying is they really neglect the performance test because they think they should just be able to do it because they practice law. But then they miss valuable, easy points because it's an artificial exercise under time constraints. It's closed universe. You don't have to know any law, but it's still asking for something slightly different than you might do at work. So you really need to just collect all the points possible on it. It's such a mistake to let that kind of languish out there and not get any attention because then, those are easy points. It's just such my favorite part of the test. I just hate when people ignore it.
I know. I hate it when I see score reports and you see the 50 on the performance test instead of a 65 or something that would be passing. And that's the reason they fail. Yeah. And it's just really, I feel like you probably could have done more on this and been fine on it. Yeah. And I think, particularly for people who maybe are in corporate law, the idea of writing a memo or a brief is very foreign at this point. Mm-hmm. So you haven't been doing legal writing class for quite a while. So, I think this is one, particularly in the online universe, where, it's just a different thing that you need to learn how to do. And it's very doable, but you need to practice some if you're actually going to do as well as you can on it.
Yeah. We also mentioned, taking time off before, which I think is incredibly important. But even if you do that, make sure you don't wait until the end to memorize everything. Because I think that those two things can kind of go together. People are like, well, I'm going to take 2 weeks off, so I'll just memorize at the end and be good. And I just think that's not, you should still take the 2 weeks off, but please don't leave everything to the end. There's just not enough time.
Right. And I think sometimes you see this in bar prep schedules, 2 weeks, memorize. That's not really the way that most people's brains work.
Yeah.
So if you start earlier, quizzing yourself on things, with our students, we actually have, quizzes that we hopefully by the end, they're able to do almost word for word of very heavily tested topics. Stuff like that you see over and over with spaced repetition is going to start sticking in your head. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be so much less stressful than trying to cram all this information in your head at the very end when you really need to be fine-tuning your writing and doing your practice questions and things like that.
Yeah. I think you make a really good point about, well, of course, we like the materials that we've developed. I think our spaced repetition quizzes are great. But we really also encourage attorney applicants, everybody, but specifically attorney applicants with limited time, to make sure they're studying heavily tested material. And we mentioned that earlier when we were talking about the MBE, that we know what's heavily tested on the MBE, but you also know what's heavily tested on the writing. And you should have a strategy that maximizes your study time on those subjects and issues. And you're going to have to be strategic because you're not going to be able to know everything. So adding some strategy to your approach is important. And I think that's where working with a tutor or someone who knows this material really well can be a benefit, because oftentimes working lawyers do not have time to become experts in the bar and then develop their own strategy.
Right. If they do, they can get our brainy bar bank and we'll tell you what's most heavily tested. But is that really the best way to be spending your time? I'm not sure. Speaking of ways to spend your time too, I think another really critical thing that hopefully people are not planning to do because you don't have time for it, and we've talked about this many times, is this active versus passive learning. Mm-hmm. So when you're time compressed, the less time you have to study, the more you need to be doing active work, not just sitting and watching videos passively while, the TV's on in the background type of thing. You need to really be digging into this material and being as efficient as possible in your study time, because you just don't have a lot of time.
Yeah. Efficiency is important for everyone, but especially anyone who's working and studying and has limited time. It's just so critically important.
Right. I mean, hopefully at this point, people have some more wisdom and have some more maturity and can sort of take this step back and say, okay, I want to do this thing. This is the task I need to accomplish. I am a working lawyer. I'm pretty good at prioritizing. I'm good at structuring my day. I'm good at, whatever it is. Let me figure out the best way to do this and then have a plan of action and actually do it.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully you're grown up at this point.
But even grown-ups, I mean, this can be a blind spot, especially if you struggled with the exam the first time. I think sometimes we think about attorney applicants just because they were successful, being like, well, you knocked it out of the park because you passed. But maybe it was a traumatic experience. Maybe you had a lot of anxiety. Maybe it was very triggering. Maybe you get accommodations for learning differences that don't really influence your day-to-day life anymore, but now are kind of popping back up because of the exam. This can be a triggering experience. So you're got to just step back and take it seriously and make sure that you have a plan that's going to, give you the opportunity to be successful.
Right. No, it was definitely, I can't say it was fun to study again for the bar exam and I actually couldn't take the attorney's exam because I wasn't far enough out. Not that I would have anyway, because literally the only reason I passed, I'm sure, is the MBE. But yeah, it's not, and it's really hard to motivate yourself. I was working at a firm. I didn't have a lot of time. Thankfully, I'd gotten a few weeks off, but had I not done that, when was I supposed to study? I was at a firm job.
Yeah. And, you've got to consider when you're using your best brain. So I was just talking to somebody about this yesterday, about planning to study while working. And I'm like, you can't just study at 10 o'clock at night because you're exhausted and that's not your best brain. And if you have had a big firm job or a firm job, any job all day, the work that you do late at night is going to not be your best. And so you've got to figure out how to collect hours that are going to let you use your best brain.
Right. I think some of this is, being realistic with your employer about what they want to do. Sometimes people are saying, well, they really want me to move to this other state and I need to pass this exam. And my question to them is well, what are they going to do for you to let this happen? If your employer is the one really pushing for this, they need to be making accommodations for you in terms of your workload so that you actually have a realistic shot at passing. Otherwise, it's a total waste of time for everyone.
Yeah, so true. Well, we're about out of time. Any final thoughts?
Well, I guess my final thought is, obviously, if you're working as an attorney, unless you're in Wisconsin, you have passed at least one bar exam. So you are capable of doing it again. And I think it's just a question of giving yourself the time and the resources you need to get it done. And I would also say maybe going into looking at your options with more of an open mind, because there are a lot of really interesting and useful tools that have been developed that may not have been available when people were doing this the first time. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think the only thing I would add is just take it seriously enough to get it done. It's such a bummer when you take time away from other life things to study, but you don't give it enough time and enough respect to get the goals that you want. So if you're going to do it, come up with a plan and let's try to really make it happen. I agree. You may as well go all in and do it once. Yeah. So, all right. Well, with that, we are out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you're still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or Alison at barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.